The Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, is perhaps the most disrespected political and state figure in the modern civilized world after Vladimir Putin. Orbán's friendly attitude toward Putin, despite Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, causes surprise and bewilderment in the EU and NATO. Hungary is a member of both organizations, but, to put it mildly, behaves strangely. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is a pro-Russian politician who lobbies for the interests of the Kremlin. Fortunately, there have always been alternative, more reasonable forces in Hungary that accurately and thoroughly evaluate the highly destructive and aggressive role of Russia in world politics. For example, starting back in the late 1980s and continuing all the way until the late 2000s, there was a prominent politician in Hungary who could very likely be described as the most anti-Russian figure in all of Central Europe. In 1989, it was he who publicly spoke of the Russian, not the Soviet Empire, and specifically demanded the immediate withdrawal of all Russian troops from sovereign Hungary. And in 2007, he harshly criticized the government for its blindness to the growing influence of Russia on Hungary through its energy giants, suggesting that the country should orient itself toward Europe. You may be very surprised to learn this, but from the very beginning of this video, I have been talking about the exact same person, Viktor Mihaly Orbán. Even back in 2008, he continued to sharply criticize the Kremlin, calling other European governments Putin's puppets, and labeling the previous Hungarian Prime Minister's support for the South Stream project as a form of national betrayal. But then, suddenly in 2009, everything changed quite dramatically. In November, Orbán unexpectedly traveled to St. Petersburg for the United Russia Party Congress, where he met Putin. He completely stopped criticizing Putin and Russia, and when a year later he became the Prime Minister of Hungary, he became famous as one of Putin's key apologists in Europe. What an incredible flip Orbán performed, changing his stance in midair in just a split second. Well, what else can you call it when you undergo such a radical transformation of your views in such a short period of time? So what exactly happened to Orbán during this period? Why did Orbán go from being a fierce critic of the Kremlin to its most ardent and vocal apologist? It was simply an event that, upon initial observation, seemed to have no direct connection to Hungary. What exactly was it? You're about to discover the full story. In reality, the plot of this story began to unfold back in the mid-1990s, and it became known thanks to the German journalist Jürgen Roth, who managed to get businessman Dietmar Clodo, a German citizen with a criminal past, to talk. Today, Clodo is the founder of the security company SS, which provides cash in transit and security services in Germany, France, and Russia. He is also rumored to have connections with various intelligence agencies. The German journalist Jürgen Roth possesses an interesting written statement from Dietmar Clodo, a so-called affidavit. We will present this testimony to you in its entirety, as this account offers a revealing look into the truth of who Viktor Orbán really is, and the hidden forces pulling his strings at this moment. In the 1990s, I lived in Budapest, where I worked as a consultant and was the owner of the private security company SAS. In Budapest, I became acquainted with the well-known businessman Semyon Mogilevich. A deep relationship of mutual trust developed between us, partly because we were both Jewish. Because of this very close, trusting relationship in the mid-90s, specifically between 1993 and 1996, he entrusted me with the task of delivering money to various individuals. One of them was a man named Sándor Pinter. By the way, he is currently the Minister of Internal Affairs of Hungary. At that time, all I knew about him was that he held some high position in the police, and of course that he worked for Mr. Mogilevich. I officially met him later after he left the police. That was back in 1996 or 97. Semyon Mogilevich asked me to give him money, which I did. It was very clear to me then that these were influential individuals. For me at that time, Sándor Pinter was just one of many corrupt officials to whom I handed over envelopes on behalf of Mogilevich. I received him and other people at my house in the 3rd district of Budapest. They took the money in envelopes. It was 10,000 German marks each time. This continued until the year 1996. And later on, these operations were carried out through someone else entirely. One time, it was in the spring of 1994, shortly before the parliamentary elections, Mogilevich's interpreter brought me a suitcase containing about 1 million marks. It was intended for a young man, but this young man did not want to enter my house. I said to him very clearly, "Listen, I have this suitcase with all of that absolute mountain of damn money and I am simply not going to go outside with it. So if you refuse, then I'll give it right back to Mr. Mogilevich and let him take the suitcase with the millions. I really don't care." And he did eventually come up to see me, together with another distinguished and elderly gentleman, and I brought out the suitcase with the money. At the time, I wasn't interested in who he actually was. Only after the parliamentary elections did I finally realize that the young man I had met was Viktor Orbán from Fidesz. Mogilevich called it a pivotal contribution to the election campaign. Among other people who regularly collected their share were Laszlo Tonhauser, then head of the organized crime department of the Budapest police, István Sándor, former senior police investigator, and Laszlo Just, an influential figure in the media. The main reason why I was the one who had to personally deliver this money was that I had no connection to the Russians. And as the chairman of the international section of the independent Hungarian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I was regarded with a significant level of respect. I hereby solemnly declare under the penalty of perjury that I have provided the absolute truth in this matter. June 15th, 2016. Quite interesting testimony, isn't it? It's going to get even more interesting. But before we continue, I'd like to point out one sad fact. The results of a comprehensive sociological survey conducted in 2022 showed that Hungarians expressed their full support for Russia in the current war with Ukraine. So, obviously, one might assume from these findings that the people of Hungary really do love Russia. But that's not the case. Otherwise, how can you explain the fact that historically, Hungarians and Russians have never been allies and have traditionally found themselves on opposite sides of the barricades, both in the First World War and the Second? By the way, everything that Russian occupiers are currently doing in Ukraine today, the Hungarians also did in the Black Earth region and Central Russia back during the years of the Second World War. From the perspective of YouTube's censorship restrictions, this topic is complicated, so we made a separate special video and posted it on our Patreon. It would be interesting to see Orban's face if he were confronted with this. The link to our Patreon is in the suggestion, the description, and the first comment. And now, let's get back to the compromising material on the Hungarian Prime Minister. In addition to the written testimony mentioned above, Dietmar Klodo also gave an interview to the Austrian TV channel ORF, where he stated that in the 1990s, Sándor Pintér received 10,000 Deutsche Marks every month from Mogilevich so that the Hungarian police would turn a blind eye to his dealings with Ukraine and Russia, while the main office of the crime boss was located in Budapest. The Hungarian politicians and law enforcement officials themselves, of course, deny any acquaintance with Dietmar Klodo. Klodo's accusations are easy to ignore since he is, to put it mildly, a man with a far from spotless reputation. It's a completely different matter if there is documentary evidence to support these accusations. And Mogilevich is exactly the specific kind of person who might be in possession of such evidence. The actual underlying reason as to why the envelopes had to be handed over to Hungarian politicians at Klodo's house, and not out on the street, was absolutely and certainly not just his concern for the safety of the money. The answer is quite simple. A hidden camera recorded the process of handing over the money at Klodo's house as a precaution, and the tapes were then given to Mogilevich. Semyon Mogilevich moved to Budapest in 1990 and lived there until the early 2000s, just 300 meters from the Russian embassy. During the privatization period, through various schemes, he managed to gain control over a weapons manufacturing plant in Hungary. According to the FBI, his main activity was laundering money for the Solonsevskaya organized crime group. Today, Mogilevich is among the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals. Since the 90s, he has attracted the attention of the FBI, the Italian police, and Swiss intelligence agencies, and in 2003 he was placed on Interpol's international wanted list. At that point, he had to move from Budapest to a dacha near Moscow and refrain from leaving Russia. A conversation about Mogilevich was captured on the famous tapes of SBU Major Melnichenko in the year 2000. According to Leonid Derkach, Mogilevich actually lived in Hungary, but at that moment had become a neighbor of Gennady Zhuganov at a dacha near Moscow. In response to Leonid Kuchma's surprise, Derkach explained, well, he had good relations with Putin since the Leningrad days. Kuchma remarked, let's hope we don't get caught up in this. At the same time, the dossier on Mogilevich was mysteriously destroyed at the SBU in 2005. And in 2008, Mogilevich was unexpectedly arrested in Moscow in connection with the Arbat Prestige Company case on suspicion of tax evasion. Mogilevich spent a year and a half in custody, and in July 2009 he was released from jail on his own recognizance. And soon after, the case against him was closed due to a complete lack of evidence of a crime. According to Dietmar Klodo, in order to secure his release, Mogilevich had to part with some of his assets and also provide a service to the Kremlin by handing over compromising material on Viktor Orbán. The businessman is convinced that in exchange for his freedom, Mogilevich could have handed over compromising tapes to Nikolai Patrushev. In any case, Orbán was unexpectedly invited to Moscow, right after Mogilevich's arrest. And it was at that very moment that Orban made a completely unexpected shift in his position. An interesting fact, one of the signs of Orban's friendship with Putin was the restoration in Budapest. Just think about it, of monuments to Soviet soldiers, and not only those who liberated the country from fascist invaders, but also those who died suppressing the Hungarian uprising of 1956. During the era of the Soviet regime, these events were officially described as an uprising in Hungary. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, they are referred to as the Revolution of 1956. But if Putin has compromising material on you, you might even call the monument something else entirely. When Putin laid flowers at this monument in 2015, a scandal broke out in Hungary. The Hungarian press accused the Fidesz government, which allowed the restoration of the monument to the Russian enforcers, of violating the country's constitution. However, there is also another possible reason for the sudden about-face of Hungarian Prime Minister Orban. It cannot be ruled out that the Kremlin did not use Mogilevich's compromising material on Orban, or perhaps was not even aware of it, and Orban's visit to Moscow simply happened to coincide in time. However, the Kremlin has not only a stick but also a carrot. Russia is actively developing cooperation with Hungary, from which not only Hungarian and Russian taxpayers benefit. During his time as Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán has met with Vladimir Putin many times. According to Orbán, relations with Russia cannot be built on principles, only benefit matters. Based on this, it is worth paying attention to the project to expand the nuclear power plant in Paks, Hungary, which costs 10 billion euros. Moreover, the project is financed by Russia, although officially these funds are considered a loan. To ensure the success of the nuclear power plant, Hungary even introduced an additional tax on solar panels in 2015. It is entirely within the realm of possibility that both Orban and Putin have a stake in this strategic deal. When the Hungarian government supported the expansion of the nuclear power plant in Paks, Rosatom was chosen for the construction without even holding a tender, and the deal's documents were classified for 30 years. What a surprise, right? When the European Commission launched an investigation due to the lack of transparency in the deal, the Hungarian government claimed there was a political motive behind it. In the end, the investigation led nowhere. The EU does not have any supranational bodies for investigating corruption. There is an anti-corruption bureau in the European Union, but it only assists national agencies in fighting corruption. And that means that in the end, the Hungarian officials themselves are responsible for the European Commission's investigation. The very same people who are suspected of corruption. It would be quite easy for one to simply overlook such an odious political figure as Orban. Let him keep kissing Putin on the gums if he wants. However, the abrupt change in rhetoric from the Hungarian Prime Minister raises serious questions. For decades, you criticize Putin and Russia at every turn, and then suddenly, as if in an instant, the Russian Federation becomes the best friend of the Hungarian people. Such abrupt changes never happen without a reason. Here, either Kompromat is to blame, and we remember that this is KGB agent Putin's most frequently used tactic, or Viktor Orbán was simply bought and paid for, and in his old age he decided to live the good life and forget about the ideals of his youth. In any case, this whole Hungarian friendship with Putin smells incredibly suspicious and will definitely come back to haunt the Magyars. You don't need a fortune teller to see that.